Jeremy's War, Chapter 20. They took his body back to Fort George, and 5,000 soldiers, militia, and Indians, muskets upside down in tribute, stood in line as the coffin passed by. There had been no celebrating after the victory. Brock's death had stolen our victory from us. After the battle, most of the soldiers just wandered about, talking among themselves, asking, "Did you see it? Were you there? What happened?" I talked to no one, and no one talked to me. Most of the time I spent near Alfred, endlessly brushing and grooming him. He was all of Brock I had left. After the funeral, I wandered away from the soldiers and mourners and began to walk. I walked along the banks of the river, stared out at the green waters of the Niagara, and thought about Brock. He had often been cold to me, but never cruel. Mostly he had asked only that I serve him, and I had served him as well as I could. I thought about the day I left the farm. It seemed like years ago now. I was so different. I had killed a man, watched him die. I had seen a man I loved killed. I stopped and closed my eyes. I had loved Brock. He had taught me, looked after me when I was supposed to be looking after him, shown me what strength was, shown me how the strongest among us are weak. When I first met him, he asked if I were a good man. I'd said, what had I said? I'd said I hoped I was good enough. He liked that answer. He would have liked it. That's what he wanted for himself. To be good enough to win respect. Maitland told me that soldiers eat bad food and sleep on the ground and march and fight and die. Brock was a soldier. It was part of who he was to die like that. That was how he was supposed to die. I turned away from the river and walked back to the fort. The order to see Captain Stanton came early the next morning. I hurried over to the officers' quarters. I hadn't seen him since Detroit. I didn't want to see him now. "Sit down, Private." It was a surprising order. Privates stood in front of officers. I had never heard a captain ask a private to sit. Stanton was sorting through a great pile of papers. This was a time officers hated. The battle was over, winter was coming on, there were supplies to order, men to clothe and house through the winter months. Nothing interesting, like war, to do. Stanton shuffled through his papers and pulled out a letter. He looked at it thoughtfully for a moment, then put it down. "Do you know how to read, Private?" I nodded. "Yes, sir." "You'll remember I was the officer who recommended you as General Brock's batman. It was a risk, but an interesting risk." I sat stiffly in the chair watching him. I should be standing. Sitting was wrong. Why had he asked me to sit? "Were you happy serving General Brock?" Stanton asked. "Sir? Yes, sir, very happy." Happy was the wrong word, but I didn't know the right one. I wouldn't have said it out loud if I did. "General Brock was impressed with your work." Stanton glanced down at the letter on his desk. "He gave me this letter some days before the battle at Queenston Heights, and asked me to open it in the event that Stanton coughed, in the event that he was killed." Stanton rubbed his eyes. It was only the day after the funeral. I was surprised by this request. I must tell you, I did not know the general well, at least no better than any of the other officers, some of whom are quite senior to me. But I see now why I was entrusted with it. He handed the letter to me across the desk. "Here, read it." I recognized the handwriting at once. Brock's script was broad and clear. The letter was dated September 30th, 2 weeks ago. It was strange seeing words written by him. It was strange reading in front of an officer, but I'd been told to read. The words were hard. I didn't even know what some of them meant, but the meaning was clear. "Captain Stanton, some months ago I asked you to procure for me from the ranks a private to serve as my batman. As you will recall, I expressed misgivings concerning your nomination of the colonial volunteer Jeremy Fields. The boy appeared too young and inexperienced even for this admittedly less than onerous task. However, I have been impressed by the service of Private Fields and wish to express my gratitude for your perspicacious choice. He has served me well and is a valuable, if at times impertinent, aid. I sense the boy is capable of greater achievement than he has been given opportunity to display heretofore. I am taking the liberty, therefore, of asking you this favor. Since, if you are reading this, misfortune shall have fallen upon me, I am no longer able to execute my own affairs. I would deem it a great service if you would attend to the proper education of Fields. I have instructed my solicitors in London, in the event of my death, to set aside a sum of £500 in trust to be used to defray the costs of bringing Fields to England and supporting him while he pursues his studies. I believe he has had little formal schooling, and it may be some years before he is able to pursue whatever vocation awaits him. If you would see to it that my wishes have been carried out, and expedite Fields' discharge from His Majesty's service, and attend to those necessary details, such as his transportation to England and accommodation once there, I fear these tasks would be daunting for one of such purely colonial experience. I will owe you a great debt, which obviously I shall be unable to repay. Please accept my deepest apologies for placing this burden upon your shoulders, and accept also my sincerest gratitude for your services. I remain your humble and obedient servant, Isaac Brock. Do you understand the letter? Stanton asked. I nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak. Stanton rose from his chair. Very well, then. I will see to the details. You'll need tutoring in England before you'll be ready for any other education. I'll also arrange for your accommodation there. It will take a week, I should think, to arrange your discharge. Until then, consider yourself on leave. When would you like to depart for England? I shook my head. Whenever you want? It should be soon. The Atlantic is not an ocean best crossed in winter. There's a ship sailing from Quebec City in 3 weeks. Can you be there? Yes. Then we'll try for that date. Have you any questions? I had only one. Sir, can I keep the letter? Stanton paused. I'd rather hoped to keep it myself. We were all devoted to him, you know. He cleared his throat. But the letter is about you, and it really belongs to you. Yes, take the letter. I stood up and snapped to attention. Will that be all, sir? Yes. Return here in 1 week. That will be all, Fields. Sir. I pivoted sharply about face. I was exaggerating everything I did, hoping it would keep me in control. Fields. Stanton's voice came from behind. I swung around. Sir? He stood behind his desk, head bent over, examining some paper. I'm rather proud that I chose you to be the General's batman. He didn't look up. I swallowed, tried to say something, but there was nothing to say. We knew what we were thinking. I closed the door softly behind me. The next morning I left Fort George and set out for the farm. In the past 5 months I'd gone through war and seen death and served a great man. Now I was going to England. It was time to say a proper goodbye to my home. The walk was colder than in May and longer, but I didn't mind. I was tougher than I was then, and used to marching mile upon mile. The gray wind whipped up at the flaps of my cloak, but I ignored it. The fields were bare as they had been bare then, but they were lifeless now. The harvest was in, and only the stubble of the crops littered the brown earth. I saw no one. The farmers were in the barns or in their homes. They had no call to be out in the fields. I stayed the first night at the village where Brock had given his speech, and the second night at York. The next morning, before the sun had fully lightened the flat clouds covering the sky, I set out for the farm. I walked slowly. 5 months ago, I traveled down this road harboring a rage for a man who had stolen my mother's farm for £20. I had wanted to kill him. Now I had killed. I killed a man I didn't know, who probably didn't deserve to die. I found it hard to remember the rage. It was past noon when I walked up the path to the house. As soon as I saw it, I knew no one lived there now. The doors to the barn were open, creaking in the wind. The barn was empty. I walked across the muddy yard to the house. A window was broken, the door ajar. I stepped inside. The furniture was gone. It was as though no one had ever lived here, as though the place had been abandoned the day it was built. There was an empty box. We'd kept wood in it, against one wall. I pulled it into the middle of the room and sat down. I tried to imagine my mother here, moving quietly about, a bowl in her hand, her apron tied about her. I tried to imagine this room filled with light from the fire, the smell of baking scenting the air, the snow beating uselessly against the window, everything inside warm and safe. I had never said goodbye to her. She never knew what became of her son. Had she known she was dying? Did she rage against it as I had raged against Uncle Will? Maybe not. She had made a home and produced a child and raised him, and given everything she had to give to those who needed her. I'm all right, Mama. Who's there? I jumped. A figure framed the doorway. It It was dark in the room. There was enough light to make out the musket pointing at me. "Who are you?" the figure asked again. "What are you doing here?" I knew the voice now. "This is my home, Uncle Will." "Jeremy?" He lowered the musket and stepped into the room. "Jeremy, it is you! My God, you gave me a fright. Seth came running to the house, said he'd seen some soldier going in here. You never know in these times." He was talking too fast, and the nervousness in his voice made it quaver a bit. "So?" He leaned the musket against the wall, but kept near it. "You're a soldier?" "Yes." "Have you fought in the war?" "Yes. I was batman to General Brock." His eyes widened. "You? That takes some believing, boy." "Doesn't matter if you believe me or not. Was this the man I had wanted to kill? I hadn't noticed before the fat under the chin, the belly that fell over the belt. Had I really hated this man? Why did you come back?" he asked. He was frightened. Had I come for his land? Had I told some British officer about him? Was the law coming? Had I really known Brock? How much trouble was he in? "I came back to see the place. I'm leaving for England. I wanted to say goodbye to the house." Did he know he sighed so loudly I could hear it? "Oh, off to England. Is your regiment returning there?" "No, I'm going to school." I didn't want to talk anymore. I had done what I came to do. I wanted to get out of this ghost of a house, off this land that had no life. I started toward the door. Uncle Will stepped backwards out into the yard. "Here." He'd forgotten his musket. I handed it to him. Fear darted across his eyes when he saw me holding the gun. He grabbed it away from me, then smiled in apology. "Well, it was good to see you again, Jeremy. You must come back here when you return from England." He didn't want me back. He didn't want to see my face again. He wanted the ship to sink in the middle of the ocean with all hands. "Goodbye, Uncle." I started down the path, then stopped. "Uncle Will?" He stood there holding the musket against his chest. "Yes, Jeremy?" "I want the family Bible." He opened his mouth and closed it. He was going to tell me it was his, that he was head of the family now, that I had no right to it. But then he thought of what might happen if he refused. What was a Bible if it would get rid of me? There were plenty of Bibles, and he had the money to buy them. "If you want it, son, you're welcome to it. Have Seth bring it to me. I'll be on the road." I turned my back on him, on the farm, on the dead past, and walked away.